Welcome to Mr. Bogema's TNReady U.S. History Must-Knows, New Immigrants, Standard 7. So we're talking about new immigrants. Now there's a difference between new immigrants and old immigrants. Old immigrants were the immigrants who came to the United States before the Civil War. They're from Northern and Western Europe. Many of them spoke English, had skills, many had money, and many of them were Protestants. New immigrants came after the Civil War. They're from Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia, and particularly China and Japan. Few of them spoke English. The immigrants from Europe were Catholic or Jewish. They had few skills. Many were poor. They're going to settle in ethnic clusters, ethnic neighborhoods in American cities. So let's take a look at our first chart here, new immigration 1861 to 1920. So you can see the pink, Central and Eastern Europe from 1901 to 1920 is going to account for 44% of immigrants coming into the United States, and then almost 30% are from Southern Europe, mostly Italy and Greece. So you can see the decline in green, Northwestern Europe. Now, why are they coming to the United States? Well, there's many reasons, and the reasons why they're leaving their home countries are the push factors. So many European immigrants coming to the United States are living in poverty. They have difficulty finding access to land. And most of them are going to be tenant farmers. They might be persecuted because of their religion. There might be civil wars and rebellions in their home countries. What does the United States have to offer? The United States has the availability of jobs. We talked about industrialization. We talked about constitutional freedoms. So freedom of religion is a big one, freedom of speech, freedom of press. And many coming from Europe are going to pass through Ellis Island. It's an immigrant processing station in New York City. So that's where many immigrants were processed and allowed into the country. One of the biggest restrictions, of course, would be is if they had a contagious disease or if they were wanted for any sort of crimes. Now, many of these new immigrants had difficulties assimilating, and they ended up kind of living in slums and tenement housing in America's northern cities. And so we have Jacob Riis was a photographer who wanted to document these the living conditions of new immigrants in the United States. And we also had Jane Addams, who was a social reformer who built and advocated for settlement houses. These were community centers for new immigrants to help them assimilate into the United States, help them find jobs, learn English, provide showers and food and daycares for these new immigrants. This is Jacob Riis's most famous photograph, a crowded tenement, crowded with Eastern and Southern European immigrants in New York City. So he used flash cameras to take these pictures because there's no ventilation or electricity yet or running water in these tenements. And here's Jane Addams' Hull House. That's her famous settlement house in Chicago. Now, because of the differences in these new immigrants, they're vastly different than old immigrants. They're having trouble assimilating. We have the rise of nativism. Nativists are anti-immigrant Americans. They don't want the immigrants coming into the United States. They're different. Their religion's different. They are settling in these ethnic neighborhoods because of cultural and language barriers. And so the biggest group that's going to be excluded will be Chinese immigrants, although they helped. They made up a large portion of the labor force to construct the Transcontinental Railroad. Western Americans, especially in California, aren't going to want Chinese immigrants in the United States. They're vastly different. There's a lot of racism involved with nativism. So the government's going to pass its first immigration restriction law. Chester A. Arthur is going to pass the Chinese. Let's look at our first test question. We have a graph showing immigration between 1861 and 1920. This is the period of new immigration. So we see a decline in Northern and Western European immigrants. So the decline really begins around 1890. We have a decline in immigrants from that region of Europe. And we have the rise of immigrants coming from Central and Eastern Europe. So we have a spike here of immigrants coming in. So the question is based on the graph and your own knowledge, which conclusion can be made? So we're seeing the rise of Central and Eastern European immigrants. And we know that one of the reasons why they were coming were those push factors, persecution and poverty in Europe. So that leads us to be immigration to the United States from Central and Eastern Europe increased because of political and religious persecution at home. Our next question, what was the main reason given for the creation of these restrictions? So we're looking at this question, and it's about 1882, a moratorium on Chinese labor immigration, and that's the Chinese Exclusion Act. So what was the main reason for this? And we talked about Americans fearing them mostly because of labor issues. We see the keyword labor, so we're looking at reducing competition for U.S. jobs. All right, how did Jacob Riis and Jane Addams affect the lives of immigrants during the 20th century? Well, we know Jacob Riis was the photographer in New York City, the social reformer who photographed immigrants in poverty, and Jane Addams built the whole house, settlement house, to provide social and educational opportunities. So we're going to go with D.